Let's begin with just a basic greeting. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And as I already mentioned, the title of this paper is Limiting Factors in Widespread Adoption of Active Queue Management in the Philippines Consumer Electronics Space. So the first question that all of you may reasonably think is, why? Why would someone go through the trouble of researching about this concept in particular? Well, let me tell you a brief story. As someone who lives in the Philippines, the country is infamous for having a very slow internet experience and a very poor one at that. A lot of consumers often complain about frequent outages, spikes in their internet, and often poor performance in general. And that is not helped by the fact that the prices are very high compared to our other Asian counterparts. Effectively speaking, the consumer is left on their own. What do we do in order to solve this problem? And in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, that makes things even worse, considering that face-to-face events are effectively shut out, and therefore that leads to compromised productivity. And we're already trying to compensate for whatever little we can get. And with the combined poor experience, any productivity that we can do, that we can compromise with, is effectively on a standstill. So then, I was also a subject of those poor internet experiences, and I figured, well, this cannot work. I have things that I need to do online, and I cannot afford to be missing out because of me having audio problems or video problems. So I jerry-rigged my own custom third-party router into solving my problem, which is active queue management. And when I first used it, it worked. It was very useful. My internet was suddenly far more responsive than before, in spite of the fact that many people were using it. And overall, people were happy in my household. And I have applied that solution to many others. However, the question becomes, wait, if this is such a good solution and it does work, why does no one know anything about it? Why does anyone barely know anything about it aside from the enthusiasts? And so that leads to the rationale of this paper. The two main talking points I'd like to bring up are the lack of responsiveness and the lack of notoriety of active queue management. These are two primary factors as to why this research was done. On the first talking point, the lack of responsiveness to the concept as a whole and to the general internet experience of people is one major factor. Why? Because a poor internet which does not respond well leads to a whole host of issues in terms of this Zoom call that we're having. Sometimes, if the internet's not responsive, I may end up having audio issues. I may end up lagging in video. And that's not ideal because I need to be able to speak and communicate effectively in order to get my message across. And if my internet is hampered because of that, then it's not possible for me to be able to talk properly in this space. Second talking point is the lack of notoriety. What do I mean by this? It has been quantitatively and qualitatively proven that active queue management does work in reducing buffer bloat. Buffer bloat is essentially a term that is characterized by excessive latency caused by the network buffer in a residential or commercial network being full and not able to be managed effectively. This solution does work. It solves many problems, and yet nobody knows about it, or no one is willing to take the time to know it. And that's a huge problem because you can already see full well that this allows people to be responsive, to compensate for lost productivity due to the COVID pandemic, and yet no one knows anything. It's left as a concept. Only enthusiasts are willing to jerry-rig something and try it out for themselves, when in fact, more consumers need to reach this technology, this form of buffer management in order to be able to have a good experience as a whole. So what are the two relevant concepts that will be involved in this? First, since this is a question of why active queue management is not widely involved in the consumer space or not being talked about, that's something that is going to be a major factor. Active queue management is essentially a queue optimization system in order to prioritize packets that are of sensitive latency and also to manage those that are not that sensitive, so that even in spite of a full network load, the experience compared to a network that does not have an effective active queue management system is inferior. Effectively, this makes your internet experience much better. And since it involves consumers wanting to get this technology or to try out this technology for themselves, another relevant concept is consumer behavior, characterized by how consumers act and decide when it comes to how they purchase their products or whatever they need or want, depending on many factors such as their income, their state's purchasing power parity, and so on. So what's the research methodology that was used? In the context of my country, the Philippines, we gathered a sample of 200 respondents. We gathered it from a mix of the three major regions in the country, the north, the center, and the south of the country, specifically Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. We did this, well, more specifically, I did this so that we can have a varied mix of respondents to understand their differing social economic backgrounds, why they pay for whatever internet they do, and their willingness to pay for more, and also to know whether or not they're willing to pay for a third-party solution in order to solve their network woes. So with that being said, what are the general consumer observations that were figured out in researching this? There are a few talking points. One, the average person, the average Filipino, they generally do not know the specific cause of their woes, which is Bufferbloat. But then again, that's only because this is a more complex networking term. Second, consumers are willing to do two things. One, they're willing to pay a price for a better experience and willing to pay for higher network speeds. This is because of the fact that, as already mentioned, the Philippines is notorious for having a very poor experience online and is subject to frequent complaints. And people erroneously think that paying for higher speed solves the problem, when in fact, those who have a deep understanding of this problem know that speed is generally not the issue, but rather latency. And it's also implied that these internet providers are not willing to do anything to solve the problem. Now, there's a good mix of income brackets in this study based on the ranges given by our local economic authority, with low income being up to $433 monthly, medium up to 2,600, and high up to 4,000. Now, generally speaking, the Filipino consumer, in spite of the COVID pandemic, still prefers to buy from conventional channels. That is retail, brick and mortar, and so on. Although there is an increasing presence of online sales, this is not the majority, and only younger consumers tend to do this. So with that being said, the main contribution of this paper is customer profiles in the Philippine context. So what is it that a budget-friendly consumer would want, a low-income consumer would want? Here are the basic specifications. So as you can see, a basic single-core, low-frequency CPU is good enough with 8 megabytes of flash and 64 megabytes of RAM. This is barely enough in order to be able to get the bare minimum of features needed, including active queue management, which is notoriously CPU heavy. We're only going to provide the basic Wi-Fi standard, which is AC, Wi-Fi 5 in colloquial terms, with WPA2, and with the bare minimum of Wi-Fi range, which is a maximum of 20 decibel milliwatts. The ideal price point for this is 30 US dollars, since in the Philippines, this is enough, this is considered affordable for the majority of Filipinos in my country. In terms of the middle income bracket, we can afford to put more features, slightly more, and give a higher price. But this is tend to the middle income bracket. So with that said, here are some specifications. A single core medium frequency CPU with 8 to 16 megabytes of flash and 64 to 128 megabytes of RAM. This will allow for more programs to be installed in the router in order to affect the consumer and their preferences when it comes to how they want to control their network as they wish to. We're going to provide a slightly better Wi-Fi standard, still Wi-Fi 5, but with better range. Instead of just 20 decibel milliwatts, which is not enough to penetrate through concrete walls, we're going to increase the power limit to around 25 decibel milliwatts with medium powered antennas, while still providing WPA2, which is a still acceptable standard considering the circumstances of the Philippine market. And for those who prefer the best of what a router can offer in terms of solving their network, and for those who prefer a higher bandwidth speed in order to increasingly utilize their network for very fast downloads and uploads, we'd offer something that is the best of what is currently available for a router, which is a single core, high frequency to even a dual core CPU with at least 16 to 32 megabytes of flash and higher than 128 megabytes of RAM. It would be recommended to provide the latest Wi-Fi standard, which is Wi-Fi 6, or Wi-Fi 6E, which is 802.11ax, and also to provide the latest security standard, since these people tend to have the latest tech products at their household. For example, the latest phones, the latest laptops, which have access to wireless protected access free or WPA free, which is the most secure standard of Wi-Fi available, and to also provide even higher powered Wi-Fi antennas, which provides a maximum of 30 decibel milliwatts. Ideally, we'd put this in the $60 to $80 range because of the fact that these people have high disposable income and are willing to spend more to get more. So effectively, what is the main contribution of this paper? It's pretty significant considering that a lot of the studies that have been done so far are more conceptual in nature, and there are not a lot of studies that actually tackle the applied aspect of this. Given that active queue management is a technology that works, is demonstrably proven in many settings, the push now is not whether or not to be in the proving ground phase, because that has already been established, but to find efforts as to how to push this technology and make it more commonplace, especially for countries that have the losing end of the stick when it comes to their internet experience. Like my country, given our significant geographical challenges in providing good internet to our constituents. Thus, with that being said, we have to make do with what little we have. And one of the ways to make things more efficient in spite of what little we have is through this technology. Additionally, it provides a pathway for the concept to be bridged to reality, to be into the setting of applied, in order to transition from concept to applied setting, so that more research papers can be done on this, and to also provide more ways into promulgating this technology, which is active queue management, to many countries around the world, especially for those with low internet speeds as an average. However, this paper does not come without its own flaws, of course. The scope is very limited to only the Philippines, and that, of course, means that the recommendations that are made in this paper are only appropriate insofar as the Philippines is concerned. More research studies will have to be done in other countries in order to match with their to match with the social economic factors that are in that area. For example, another country's purchasing power parity, their GDP per capita, those factors also have to be considered in order to make specific recommendations to be able to actively promulgate this technology into many places. And with that being said, that's essentially it for this presentation.